bushfires galore down here. We're talking about 60, 70 metre flame heights. 60, 70 metre flame height.
Hello, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this event with Bush Heritage Australia and WIRES to talk about the incredible work both organisations have been doing since the 2019-20 Australia bushfires to help bushfire recovery and resilience efforts across Australia and beyond. My name is Chris Doherty and I'm a director with Friends of the Australian Bush Heritage Fund here in the US. As you probably guess, I am Australian, but I've been living here in the US for the last 6 years, and I'm delighted to be your host. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I'm sitting here in Portland, Oregon. Portland rests on traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Wasco, Cowlitz, Clackamas, Chinook, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. So please join us in acknowledging these groups that have stewarded this land throughout generations. Now, question for the audience. Do you know the traditional native inhabitants of the land you're calling in from? If you do, we'll ask you to pop it in the chat box. We have people from all over the US and Canada, I believe, and most states of Australia as well. So we'd love it if you do know the traditional owners of the land you're on to pop it in the chat box. It would be really interesting for us to see who's coming from where. And I'll ask the speakers to do the same as well. We've got people from Wiradjuri country, Ohlone, Gundungurra, Oneida Nation of the Thames, Turrbal and Eugera. Another one from Ohlone, Whyalla in Australia, Bungala country, Darrell country, Pangarang from Wangaratta, not far from my home in Wagga Wagga, which is Wiradjuri country. And you'll see the hashtag Honour Native Land there to help encourage people to do this in the US, where it's not quite so common as in Australia. Really interesting, people coming from all over the world, and looks like a lot of people are aware of the native owners of the land that they're calling in from, which is fantastic. Thank you very much. Okay, let me introduce the webinar purpose. So the purpose of the webinar today is to provide you with an overview of the impact Australia's 2019-20 bushfire season has had on Australian species and landscapes, and to share updates on what progress in bushfire recovery has been achieved with your help 12 months on, and what kind of work conservationists have planned going forward to make the Australian bush even more resilient in the future. We also hope to provide an avenue for sharing lessons learned between the Australian and Californian experience with increasingly extreme bushfire and wildfire events. And I know many of us in the US have been affected in various ways, and there are a lot of similarities in the challenges both regions face. And of course, to generate hope for the future and to help you understand how you can help these efforts too. So the next 30 minutes will be a conversation with our speakers, followed by a Q&A with you. So as we go ahead, do post your questions for our speakers in the Q&A function as we go, and I'll pick those up later when we get to the Q&A section. For general comments for us, or if you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat function that you see there. You can also try to email us at events@bushheritage.org.au, and we'll try to address those as quick as possible. We are recording the webinar, and an email link to that recording will be sent out in a few days' time. Okay, let me introduce Bush Heritage Australia, WIRES, and our speakers. Bush Heritage is an independent not-for-profit that buys and manages land and partners with Aboriginal people so they can protect Australia's irreplaceable landscapes and magnificent native species forever. Today, Bush Heritage works across 11.3 million hectares, which is 28 million acres, or roughly the size of the state of Ohio in the US, of land. Their reserves and partnerships protect threatened ecosystems and 6,700 species of plants and animals, including at least 226 threatened species. From Bush Heritage joining us, I want to introduce Richard Geddes. So Richard has over 18 years experience managing conservation and land management projects across Australia, Indonesia, and the Galapagos Islands. Richard joined Bush Heritage in 2017 as National Fire Program Manager, and part of this role includes coordinating the fire management program across the country on Bush Heritage reserves, as well as providing technical support and assistance to Aboriginal partnership areas. Also with us from Bush Heritage is the CEO, Heather Campbell. Heather has an extensive background in conservation, sustainability, business and risk management at executive and board levels. She joined Bush Heritage as CEO at the beginning of 2019 after roles in research, corporate, and the not-for-profit sectors. She's an engineer by trade and brings a love of nature, which formed as a child on farms in New Zealand before falling in love with Australia's unique landscapes and wildlife. Also represented here is WIRES, which is Australia's largest wildlife rescue organisation and has been rescuing and caring for native animals 365 days a year for almost 35 years. WIRES' mission is to actively rehabilitate and preserve Australian wildlife and inspire others to do the same. Annually, WIRES provide rescue, advice and assistance to tens of thousands of sick, injured, orphaned and displaced animals. In the wake of the devastating 2019-20 events, WIRES began providing significant national support for wildlife, supporting over 240 projects to assist with wildlife rescue and care across every state and territory. WIRES are also working with major partners to support the long-term recovery of wildlife habitat. Joining us from WIRES is CEO Leanne Taylor. Leanne is passionate about projects and initiatives that improve animal welfare. A former law enforcement officer for the RSPCA, she has also served as an animal welfare advisor to the New South Wales Emergency Management Committee and is the current delegate representing wildlife organisations on the Australian National Bushfire Recovery Agency. We also have Vicky Lett from WIRES. Vicky has been involved with WIRES for decades and is currently a member of the large mammal species team and the koala coordinator for New South Wales. Vicky oversees koala rescue and care across the state and is extensively involved in the rescue and care of other species as well. Vicky also worked with New South Wales National Parks and Wildlife Service for over 20 years, and she has been involved in several bush care groups, including Yillamundee Aboriginal Bush Care Group, Hawkesbury Rainforest Network, Maru Reserve Bush Care, and the Hawkesbury Environment Network. And if you look closely at Vicky in the webinar, you might see something on her lap, and she might be live nursing a koala while she's dialing in to this as well. So great to see you working on the job, Vicky, with that beautiful koala. Okay, let's go to the interview, and I want to start with topic one, which is the bushfire impact. And I'm going to flick to you, Heather, on the first one. So before we dive into today's topic, in your eyes, what makes the Australian bush so special, and what inspired you to dedicate your work to protect it?
Thank you for that, Chris. And I'm coming to you from Wurundjeri country on the edge of Melbourne, so about an hour out of Melbourne. And what I love about Australia is the vastness, the uniqueness of it, and the very weathered nature of such an old continent, you know, from the tropical north and the deserts and the amazing diversity of the flowers of the southwest Western Australia or the temperate forests of Tasmania. And what is really, really special is that work with traditional owners who have been here for 60,000 years and have been actively managing the land across that time, and to be able to spend time with them listening to the stories and the songs and being out in country and learning, I've just found that really, really inspiring. What I also love is the amazing species, from that glorious koala who is trying to steal the show. I think he's beautiful. Species like that that are so, they look so cuddly, um, to all of those ones which are completely weird and wonderful and don't exist anywhere else. And certainly Australia has a number of species, or the largest number I think of species that can actually kill you. So there's that thing about snakes and spiders and scorpions and lizards that sort of walk sort of backwards to move forward, as well as all the glorious things like kangaroos and koalas. So it's just a phenomenal world that we live in, and I want my kids to be able to experience what I have growing up, and to be able to have that sense of wonder of being out in nature.
A lot to be inspired by. And Heather, the words unprecedented and extreme are used to describe the 2019-20 Australian bushfire season. So from a conservation perspective, what made that fire season so special?
I think it was the extent and the size of it, the fact that it went on for so long, impacted so many communities, and was so relentless. And I think about it, what we've seen also in the US and California, or in the Amazon, or in, Siberia, or even in places like Vietnam, just the extent of fires that are happening now, and the fact that they were all consuming. And I know I flew over a number of them, and just to see how those fire fronts that were huge, and the fact that they created their own weather that, went up into the stratosphere. And I know when I was looking across at one of our reserves that was burnt, Scottsdale, and it was one of the last fires that went through, and looking across that landscape, you can see the picture there of how the valley floor is burnt and so many seedlings were lost. And when I turned around and looked at the other direction across the Murrumbidgee River, it reminded me of Mordor from Lord of the Rings. Just that sense of everything being burnt to twigs. And you get that sort of sense of, oh, this is so devastating. How can we move forward from that? But also now, a number of months on, you're seeing the bush come back. You're seeing species return, which is absolutely fantastic. But at the time, it was just the size, the relentless nature, the devastation of it that made it so different from previous years.
And Richard, you've been working in fire management for some time. What inspired you to get into this field, and how have your years of experience prepared you for the situation we saw in 2019-20?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and hi everyone. I'm dialing in from Brisbane, which is Jagera country, and shortly after this webinar, I'm actually jumping on a plane to go about 600 miles northwest to another bushfire that started about 30 hours ago on our reserve. But going back to what inspired me, I was lucky enough to work with Aboriginal people across Northern Australia starting in the 1990s, and as a person that had grown up in Brisbane and Sydney and gone into the wilds of Northern Australia, it was a real eye-opener, and I guess a really powerful insight into the legacy that Aboriginal people had provided to Australia, and how they'd looked after the country for thousands of years. There's a photo there that's just popped up, and that's actually one of our Aboriginal partnerships up in Northern Australia in the Kimberley. And one of the most profound things that I've found since 20 or so years of working with Aboriginal people is, if you are out on country with Aboriginal people, there's this really incredible deep connection with the land, and it's a spiritual connection, it's a cultural connection, and looking after the country through creating these small fires that you can see in the background there is a really critical part of looking after the country and connecting to the country. Those young Bunuba Rangers there, they've lit some small fires in the late afternoon. The fires are really small and slow moving, so the animals can get out of the way really easily. It's lit at a time of day when the wind's starting to drop off and the dew will be setting in not long after. So fires will trickle along, just burn some of the grass and undergrowth, and not impact the tree canopy at all. According to a lot of Aboriginal people, if fires get into the tree canopy, it's a sacred space, that tree canopy. It caused a lot of damage. So culturally, it was really important not to impact those trees with fire. So One of the amazing things that I've learned about working with Aboriginal people is all these cultural protocols for fire. And from working in Kakadu, I remember standing on the sandstone escarpment up there, which was made famous by the Crocodile Dundee movie that some people may have seen. Just to my right, when I was looking out over this amazing scene, was a painting of a Tasmanian tiger, which was about 7,000 years old, because they know that the painting was that old because Tasmanian tigers in that part of Australia have been extinct. But as I was looking out over the plain, I could see these groups of Aboriginal people moving through the landscape just as the sun was starting to set, and these small patchy fires. And they were creating this incredible mosaic of burnt and unburnt patches and protecting all these really fire-sensitive areas, rainforest, sandstone heath, all these refuges where biodiversity is hanging on. It's really important. And if you look at it from the local people of Kakadu, is absolutely important to protect those fire-sensitive areas like rainforest, because there was a lot of food, fruit, yams, sacred sites. So following cultural protocols was really important to look after country. And so, just to go back to the other question, how's that sort of prepared me for the last fire season? Well, I guess it's been a number of years of really extreme fire seasons, particularly in our reserves in Queensland. The reserve Carnarvon, where I'm about to go to after this webinar, we've had severe fires there in 2017, 2018. In 2018, we had our first catastrophic fire danger on record. So, as a lot of people know, climate change has been impacting the climate. It's been driving this fire risk and extreme fire behaviour. And we've been experiencing that a number of years before the last 2019-20 fires. So I guess being prepared is really important. We combine that of burning small areas in the cool time of the year, small patchy fires which break up the country and really help us prepare for the big fires that will come from the lightning later on. So yeah, thanks, Chris. Happy to be.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And I know you're calling in from the airport as you try to get out to the property, so thanks for joining. We're going to hear a little bit more about Aboriginal partnership work a little later on, so really keen to touch on that. Leanne, I'm going to flick to you here. From a wires perspective, you and your team are no strangers to the impact of bushfires on wildlife and are well prepared to help and rescue injured animals. What inspired you to join WIRES, and what made the 2019-20 bushfire season so different for Australian wildlife?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. And welcome to all of our USA and Australian participants to the webinar. I just wish we could see you. Look, I came to WIRES about 10 years ago, and my background was in animal welfare. So I just did have this passion for, I guess, seeing really good outcomes, but had mainly worked with domestic animals and livestock. So, and what really surprised me, I guess, when I came to WIRES was just the scale and the amount of animals that we're seeing and the number of interactions. And I just couldn't have imagined the number of animals that come into care or that we come into contact with as a result of various things that are happening. I think we have been through bushfires before, and like other agencies, we thought we were well prepared. We have more than 3,000 volunteers on the ground. The 2013 bushfires in the Blue Mountains were quite severe, and so we took a lot of lessons from those. What was different this time, I think, was just, as Heather has said, the scale of what we saw was something that we just couldn't have predicted. And at any given time, there were often, more than 100 fires burning, and some of those fires joined up and became mega fires, and there were fires breaking out everywhere. So no agency or organisation could be everywhere it needed to be, and that was what was so devastating, I guess, for us and for the animals.
And Vicky, from your perspective, you've been doing this for a long time. Can you describe the situation on the ground when the fires were going on? And what did you find most challenging? And then what gave you hope and energy to carry on?
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and hi everyone. So currently I'm sitting in northern New South Wales in Gumbangir, Yagal, Bundjalung country, and I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners, past, present and future, before I get going. Basically, I think I can reiterate what everyone else has said about the scale and the scope of these fires and the intensity. And what was very difficult from a wildlife care perspective is the fires basically started in northern New South Wales, which normally doesn't burn quite as well, and as well as the Blue Mountains, for instance, or those different geographical areas. But it burned like the Blue Mountains here. It burned hot and hard, and because we had life and property losses in the human world, then it was very hard for anyone in an emergency situation, say a first responder, to think about wildlife. So I think the most difficult thing was recognising that there were many animals killed and injured out there, and we couldn't really get to them. And what keeps you going is the fact that what you really want to do is to minimise suffering and make good decisions if you can get to an animal to save it. And saving might mean that they go straight to a vet and they're assessed, and the assessment might be that the kindest thing to do is to euthanize and put them to sleep and put them out of their pain. But really what keeps you going is seeing them, hoping they'll go back. and we did have some wins during that time, and we did put a lot of energy into animals too that didn't over time recover quite the way we like them.
Thanks, Vicky. And I want to touch on koalas a little bit, because the pictures and videos of the plight of koalas during the fires was something that really got a lot of traction here in the US. I can certainly attest to that, and motivated a lot of people to help. So, so just switching to koalas, they were listed as threatened species in 2012, and then in 2019, 2020, they were impacted by drought and the catastrophic fire season. Can you give us your thoughts on the long-term positives from the worldwide recognition that we've seen for the koala's plight?
Yeah, look, I think the most positive perspective of the 1925s is basically that I think we've come to the conclusion now that we are a global community, and a community that can and will work to minimise pain and suffering for wildlife and other animals, but also hopefully get involved in habitat restoration and protection. So that, I think that's for me, that was the most exciting, is just think that across the world people cared a lot. And I think if you see that koala sitting there in that burnt area in the photo, that's an example of not being able to get to an animal in time. So he didn't die from the actual fire, but he was found 3 weeks later, sitting near a road at the base of a tree, and his organs had started to shut down. What the positives from this event and the generosity across the world is, one, now hopefully we have the training and the resources to find little animals like him before they get to this point, and then we can actually save them. We can feed them. We can bring them in and feed them if we need to until the bush recover. The other interesting thing, if we're just focusing on koalas, is we've never before had the capacity to put a lot of resources into research, and research is really important because they're really cryptic animals. So an example of that is that they have this very complex gut that breaks down eucalypt leaf, which is highly toxic. And what we've found through research with Sydney University in the last few years is that it actually breaks down the medications we give them very quickly. So for the antibiotics and the pain medication we give them, they can break that down in 2 hours, whereas in most animals it would take 22 hours, and you need that therapeutic level to stay high. So we can actually funding into research that will tell us how we can treat the animals effectively, minimise their pain, and hopefully treat those diseases like chlamydia that they're so affected by. I think I think generally we can put money into education, and really the just knowing that we can all form a network that will positively impact habitats across the world, and let's face it, we're animals and we're in trouble too. So I think that was the best thing I think about those terrible times, which I wish had never happened. And of course, another good thing is I got a koala, one of the New York koalas, which lives in the bedroom. So they were one of our fundraising koalas from the American community. So that was, he'll be cherished.
Thanks, Vicky. And that's a good segue onto topic 2, which is all about the bushfire recovery and what we've seen in the past 12 months, and some of that from the support of people on this webinar. So, Vicky, I'm going to stay with you because you talked about how difficult things were for the plighted koalas, but more broadly, 12 months on, what signs of recovery do you see? And are there any recovery projects you've led or are aware of that have resulted in unexpected progress? And what's been the most hopeful moment for you in the last 12 months?
Yeah, look, I think we're all seeing recovery at different rates across these landscapes that have been so terribly affected. So, if it depends on the sort of bush that it is and how intense the fires are. As far as recovery goes, there were green patches in there, and I think what we will see and are starting to see is animals start to recolonise. So as the trees respond, the animals are moving back in, and it'll be interesting to see how the plants respond to these very extreme fires. But more importantly, we've got to recognise that there'll be a role in all of this for the insects and the little microbes in the soil. They're all important, and I think since we've had rain and you can see leaf on the trees again, and the animals recolonising, it's starting to rebuild that biodiversity. With what I've been involved in, I suppose, is trying to assist WISE with planning for the future, with emergency response, and trying to engage with other agencies and groups to say, how can we work together? We've been involved in some small projects in planting, so restoring habitat, recognising that what we need to do over time is put time and energy and money into revegetating where there's no resilience, but also doing bush regeneration and weed management in those areas. So I think what we can do is all now, because we can focus and see that we can help as a community, a global community. It's I think that's really helpful.
Yeah. And what's been the main point of difference between the recovery efforts in sort of previous years versus the one from the last fire season? And then how's that prepared you for fire seasons looking ahead?
Well, I think the main difference for me, because when you work for national parks in New South Wales, quite often you have a role in firefighting. So we have had seasons like in 1998, 97, where we had campaign fires where we fought fires for 2 or 3 months. But of course, and they were not like this current season. We didn't have these extreme conditions where my former colleagues in national parks, who we still communicate, and they talk about the fact that the behaviour they saw they have never seen before. So what we need to do is adapt and adjust our firefighting and our management of those lands. I think going forward, and what we of course saw is, we saw people die, which we also saw in the US, and there were lots of built assets that were lost, which is devastating, as well as our wildlife, which is also an asset, and our bushland. But I think going forward, to manage our current situation with climate change, we need to be proactive about how we respond and how we do in our everyday living, do something about climate change. Like, what are we going to do as individuals? And from a wildlife point of view, we all have to care, and if we care enough and politicians realise we care, they'll listen. And the other thing is, from the reactive point of view, is we need to plan carefully and work together to respond to these events, whether they're floods or fires, whatever, or, heat events in flying fox colonies where you lose 2,000 in a day, and they're one of our pollinators and seed dispersers, one of our keystone species.
Thanks, Vicky. Richard, 7 of Bush Heritage's 36 reserves were impacted by fire last year. You're on your way to one right now. So how has recovery progressed on these reserves in the past 12 months? And have there been any positive or negative surprises for you?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I guess like any fires, it is quite site specific. The impacts of fires can be quite diverse, even within one forested area. You might get one area where the wind gets behind the fire and the fire is really intense, and then the fire might move against the wind at night time and it's not as intense. But so you really have to look at each reserve individually. But one thing that's really happened is that in Queensland, where the climate is really impacted by the annual monsoon and the tropical climate, similar to like Florida or places like that in the US, there was some really significant rain not long after the fire events last December. So it did allow for some pretty good recovery, and we were actually quite surprised that it recovered so quickly that within about 6 months, the vegetation grew back, and we actually had another fire risk on our hands. So, for example, Yorka in Queensland, around about 40% of it was burnt in December, probably about 50,000 acres. Probably about 20 to 30,000 acres was burnt very severely, and the fire moved up into the canopy of the trees, and we had even had fire whirls, like fire tornadoes, spinning and throwing out embers and creating new fires. And that was one real thing about last summer, the prevalence of really extreme fire behaviour, those fire whirls, fire tornadoes, pyrocumulus, which are actually clouds of smoke which turned into thunderstorms, which created lightning, which created more fires. So Yorka was really on the brunt of that, but we were quite surprised to see how well it did recover after rain. One thing that we're also really happy to report is that we have a really small endangered population of wallabies on Yorka, not far from where the lightning struck, and those Mareeba rock wallabies, we're really happy to report that they survived the fire and they're doing really well. And there's a picture of mum and the bub there taken not long after. I guess if we moved south into southern Australia, what happened there was that it's a more temperate sort of climate, a lot more similar to western parts of the US or California. And there'd been years and years of drought. So the forest was really under a huge amount of stress before the fires hit. And then when the fires impacted those trees, not only the drought create that really intense fire and a lot of available fuel on the ground and in the trees to create these huge fires, these firestorms, but it also just meant that the trees just had very little resilience. So there's been a lot slower sort of recovery in southern parts of New South Wales, and they really took the brunt of a lot of those firestorms. One of our reserves, Burren is probably a pretty good example of that. But we have seen that even Burren, which was severely impacted by fire, the whole forest was actually burnt. There is signs of life. The trees are regenerating. We've seen birds start to move back in, and we're really focusing on controlling the invasive plants and the invasive animals, particularly the predators, foxes and cats, to give the native plants and wildlife a chance to bounce back. Thanks, Chris.
And Heather, you work with lots of partners across the landscape, including many traditional owners who manage their own lands. How have they been impacted by last year's fire season, and what has been your joint approach to recovery? And are there any good news stories that you can share with us?
Yeah. So it's been a huge impact for everybody because the fire season starts really early, up in the northern part of Australia. And so, the middle of the year, June, July, you're starting up there and you move into fire seasons all the way through to March down south. And as Richard said, he's on the way to fight a fire now. But what has been great is how everybody's come together, and everybody's come together from a global perspective. And I'd just like to say a huge thank you to so many of you that are on this call that have helped support us, from the big foundations like, Earth Alliance, who are phenomenal, through to, donors and people that are, giving, the little bit that they can. It's all made such a huge difference. And I think the big thing too is, as we worked in partnership, we've recognized that we can bring our different skills and capabilities together to make a real difference, which has been phenomenal. The other thing that's happened is that knowledge about cultural burning and how to manage the land with fire is being transferred across the landscape. And, it's well accepted practices up in the northern part of Australia, but those practices being relearnt down in the southeast of Australia and being introduced back onto properties. One of the challenges, and I think this is a challenge for us around the globe, is we'd really like to introduce those practices, but you can imagine insurance companies are a little bit wary at the moment. And so trying to get insurance for traditional owner groups to do that has become a real challenge. And I'm not sure what it's like in the US, but my guess it's probably a similar challenge too for First Nations people to be able to introduce some of those practices. But we're just really enjoying the fact body coming together, being able to work with other conservation organisations, with the general community, with government, with amazing groups like Wires, and the work they do is all bringing our collective skills together makes such a huge difference. And I have hope that our planet will still be an amazing place to live, because if we work together, we can make a huge difference.
Sure can. That leads us on to topic 3, the future and the work to be done. And Leanne, I'm going to call on you for this one to give us a wise perspective with this question. In terms of future fire seasons, what do you see as the most threatening risks to Australia's biodiversity and wildlife?
Look, I think the obvious one, Chris, is climate change. One of the things that we were seeing prior to the fires, the Black Summer fires, was that the animals that we were seeing coming into care were coming in because they were just purely dehydrated and emaciated, so through lack of food. So, that's definitely a risk. There's a whole range of other threats to wildlife. I do share Heather's positivity though, and for the future, and should we ever face an event like that again, because I think what this event has done, and we recognise, it was one of those events where I know I felt very conflicted, because it was so catastrophic, and yet the international attention and support was so unbelievable that that's what made it unprecedented, and it has focused in this light on some of the real issues, so that we can, and it's connected groups, people, in ways that never would have happened before. And Wires and Bush Heritage, I guess, is just one example of that, where we're working in isolation with what we do in terms of going out and picking up sick and injured and orphaned animals, and yet now it's great to partner with an organisation that's so totally focused on conservation and habitat, because you can't have one without the other. So, so I think, look, the risks are many, but the opportunities are great.
Good to hear. And Richard, what about you? What do you see as the most threatening risks to Australia's biodiversity and wildlife? I know climate change is top of mind for you.
Yeah, that's right, Chris. I think climate change is certainly driving a lot of the extreme fire behaviour and the severe impacts on our environment. But that's something that I guess requires a political solution and a long-term solution, and out of reach of most of us on the call today. But collectively, we can certainly support a political movement to try and raise awareness and to deal with climate change. But apart from climate change, I think one of the biggest threats is the lack of being prepared. I think it was a real eye-opener the last 2019-20 season for lots of parts of Australia, and it really raised people people's awareness of the risk of fire and the risk of fire to people and the environment. So being prepared is really important. So that can be in lots of different ways. If you're a community or a person living out in the bush or in the forest in California, and you need to have your house prepared and your community prepared and know what to do in the case of a fire, that's absolutely critical. We need to have really good resourcing of land management. Unfortunately, the funding for land management is often impacted by political decisions or governments that will only give funding for 1 or 2 years. So we really need that long-term commitment and funding to do this every year, because bad fire seasons will come and go, but we need to do it every single year to make sure that we're ready. So you're having enough money to do the fire breaks, to do those small cool burns like Aboriginal people have showed us to do over thousands of years, to identify key conservation areas and to make sure that those areas get special attention so that they're ready for a big fire season. Things like threatened species, the koala, the night parrot that we've got on one of our reserves in Western Queensland. There's all these specific strategies that are site-specific and need to be resourced properly. So, and another thing that we're really doing is we're training up a lot of our staff so that they're ready for the fire season. We've got a lot of ecologists and people with animal handling now that are trained in fire. So we'll be able to respond to animal welfare issues as well, which is something that we're really looking forward to having a bit more capacity in. Thanks, Chris.
And Leanne, I'm going to flip back to you. Richard talked a lot about what Bush Heritage is doing to minimise those risks and give Australia's wildlife a fighting chance going forward. Give us a perspective from Wires around what you've got planned to really minimise the risks going forward.
My apologies for that. Look, we've invested in emergency preparation work with our team, and one of the things that we have done is identify gaps in other states. So unfortunately, I mean, Wires has been around a long time and our carers have been fairly well resourced. But we know that in the other states things are quite patchy, so we want to spend a lot more, I guess, time and energy investment there in terms of everyday emergencies for wildlife. We've undertaken some sort of fairly large-scale projects to address the immediate needs. So one of those is working with Sydney University to install more than 800 arboreal drinkers for animals nationally, and also working with other groups like Landcare. So I think in terms of, and one of the things we say is that the animal experience is very, very different to the human experience in a fire. And so where human recovery, can happen in the short term and people can rebuild to some extent, habitat takes much longer, and rebuilding threatened species is a much longer term project. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
And Leanne, thanks for taking that while you're managing your dog there. We're on to our last question. And Vicky, I really would like your perspective on this, since you've been doing this work so long. What changes do you expect and hope to see in conservation management and wildlife protection in Australia and other fire-prone countries?
The changes I would like to see is the recognition that we are a global community. So if we lose habitat and animals in the US or the Amazon or Siberia, which is almost unheard of, then we need to, as a community, work on that. Like, we can't, if we work separately, we're in real strife. I think going forward, as a wildlife carer, one of the things you realise very quickly is that even if you fix animals, if you've got nowhere to put them, then is that cruel to do that, to put them out and put them in a place where it's so compromised that they've got a very, very hard life? I really think that it's sort of hard to articulate, because as a wildlife carer, you actually get to see animals recover, which makes you feel really good, and you release them, but then you also get to see very often animals that are in a bad way. So going forward, I would like to see political pressure put on our governments to recognise the things we need to do to maintain. Look, it's the planet, really, isn't it? It's not about Australia or the US, or it's about recognising the value of our natural landscapes and protecting them and expanding them again. So that I think that sort of does it for me. And I really like, we've got little Donny here, who's not named after Donald Trump, but he's named after the guy who used the cherry picker to get him down. Yeah, so the hope for the future is that Donny, survives my care and then gets released into a place where he can be reasonably safe. But he's going to be exposed to the things that koalas should be, the threats, but he's also going to be exposed to things like chlamydia. And because we haven't looked after things, they're quite often under stress, which means their immune system is compromised. So going forward, I'd like for us to continue the conversation and support one another, and hopefully do some good across the planet, I suppose.
Yeah, makes sense, addressing things as a system rather than in silos. So, Richard, what about from your perspective? What changes would you hope to see in conservation management?
Yeah, I guess I've got a similar views to Vicky. I think one really important thing that needs to be reinforced is that we need to have a tenure blind approach to fire management and land management and conservation. All these problems, whether it's fire or feral animals or invasive weeds, they move across boundaries between national parks, forests, private land, etc. So unless we have a coordinated regional approach where everyone is on the same page and looking for the same outcomes, we're not going to solve this problem. So Bush Heritage, I think, does that pretty well. We work with national parks really closely. Like, for example, I'm about to go to a fire in Carnarvon, and we've got a national parks crew there. We've got neighbouring pastoralists that are running cattle. They're on the fire line with us. We've got conservationists ourselves there. So we're bringing everyone together to fight that common enemy, if you like, and to give our wildlife a chance. So I think, yeah, that concept of being tenure blind and longer term funding, not just 2 or 3 years. We need that longer term funding and commitment to give wildlife a chance. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, thanks so much, everyone. We're at the end of the interview section, and we do have a few questions that have come in. So I'm just going to look at those, see what they are, and then put them out to the group. So the first one is really topical. We have people from all over the world here, but we do have quite a few from the US and Australia, and we did see similar sorts of impacts in terms of wildfires and the severity in both countries. So this question is about shared lessons learned. So maybe for Richard or for Vicky, what do you think Australia's lessons learned are for the US? How could the US learn from what we've been doing in Australia? Richard, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I have read a bit about the fires in California, but I'm certainly no expert. But there is similarities in what's happened in terms of the fire problem. I guess historically in Australia, and things have changed in some ways, but historically what has happened is that Europeans came here, over 200 years ago, and they were scared of fire. They actively stopped Aboriginal people from carrying out their fire practices. And so most of the southeast of the continent, those practices stopped a long time ago. And there's a big movement to try and bring that and to reduce the fuels in the forest and woodland and try and stop some of these big fires. But the legacy was that fire was excluded for many, many, many years. And the same thing happened in California, where CAL FIRE and other agencies got really good at putting out fires. And so for over 50, 60, 70 years, we've stopped fire, which is a natural thing that should be in forests. And the fuel loads have built up and built up and built up and created this problem. Now, that's just one part of the problem. Obviously, climate change and extreme weather is driving it. There's always lots of different factors sort of combining with it. But I think with California in particular, adopting similar practice to Australia and what Native Americans have done in history as well, is those small patchy fires in winter and in cooler times after rain will go a long way towards stopping these mega blazes when we've excluded fire for many years. The forest is tinder dry and it's just a matter of time before a mega fire starts. So I guess that's one sort of similarity between across the Pacific. Thanks.
Yeah. And Leanne, this is a really interesting question that's come in. I'm going to see if you have a point of view on it. Can you discuss the ways in which tourism infrastructure re-established after the fires and how that can be used to help reinforce the vitality of Australian wildlife and landscapes, perhaps in new or sustainable ways? And maybe, Heather, you might have a perspective on this as well. How can tourism infrastructure and the money that comes in from tourism help with recovery efforts?
Look, I think, and I won't go into detail, but I think, one of the things that draws people to Australia is our wildlife, and tourism has come a long way in finding ways that people can experience those animals in the wild, and sometimes those experiences they're a little more difficult to have because our wildlife, they can be hard to see, but people want to have those experiences. So investment in tourism infrastructure is important because those kind of experiences help inform the world about why it's important to maintain the environment and the environment in Australia, and therefore preserve our animals. So I think the Australian government has a role in making sure that there is an adequate level of infrastructure that's appropriate, but that also protects what we have. It'll be interesting to see how some of that evolves post fires, given that there's just so much work to be done. And I think more than ever since the fires, people will want to come and see how things have recovered and know that there have been, there's been a good outcome, and they've probably had, I guess, more exposure to Australian wildlife than ever. The photos that were sort of beamed around the world have really sparked an interest. We saw an interest from every continent.
Yeah, and pictures like we see with Vicky and her very cuddly koala are certainly helpful. Heather, what are your thoughts?
Look, tourism has a really important part to play to connect people in, and one of the things we find is when we take people out into the landscapes, and particularly with traditional owners and hearing their stories and getting that sense and that feel of the connection to the land and the species, it is life-changing. And that will then help create a greater movement of people to care for our planet. But we have to do that tourism lightly. We need to leave a light footprint. So it's, working with local communities in a way that we can do that in the most appropriate way that gives people exposure, but also protects our amazing fragile environments and the species that we love so much. So it's a bit of a balancing act. Of course, in COVID times, none of us are really going anywhere. So I just encourage everybody to, dial into, whether it be webinars or live cam, vision from different parts of the world to, see species that are out there. And also one of the few benefits of COVID has actually been seeing some species actually come back into areas because they haven't had that level of intrusion from people, that we are seeing, more species or, kangaroos in urban areas, for example, which is great.
Yeah. I think we've got time for one more question. Heather, I'm going to send this one to you. Have the most recent fires changed bush heritage for the future in terms of the money that's coming in or the educational structures, for example, or the way that you're conducting your programs?
So look, it's certainly changed us in a couple of ways. We have amazing support that occurred during the fires, and as I said earlier, thank you to everybody on this call for that support, and it really was the galvanizing of the global community. what it has done is change a level of our thinking about our preparedness. We've got amazing people like Richard and the team focused, on fire, but we needed to bolster those skills so that we could, in this situation that we've got today of Carnarvon, I've actually mobilised people from around Australia to go actually and help the team on the ground. So we've got a greater focus on that. Also a greater focus on looking at those, often small reserves which weren't burnt, because they're really important refuge areas. So how do we make sure that we are managing the feral animals and the weeds on those so that the native species, we can tip the balance in their favour? And the work that we'd always done, but particularly with other, with the parks, our neighbours, private landholders, to make sure there's corridors so that animals can move through the landscape and find those areas of refuge is going to be really, really important. So, a lot of the work we were already doing, but it's changed the emphasis for us into the future, and, built upon the work and made it deeper and richer. And it's to have relationships and partnerships with people like Wires, because, we don't have the skills, and supportive, traumatized animals, but be able to connect in and understand what our role can be in the habitat is really, really important.
Yeah. And also the support that's come in from folks like the attendees on the webinar has been really important too, which is fantastic. So look, we are at the end of our time. So I really want to thank the speakers and the audience for dialing in. I thought we heard some really, really good stories around initiatives, strategies and projects that with the right resources that can really help Australia prepare for and recover from bushfires going forward, and share those lessons learned with other countries, including the US. There will be a recording of this webinar and we'll email that to you in a couple of days. But in the meantime, I want to remind everyone that the Friends of Australian Bush Heritage Fund is a US 501c3 organisation and is a good way for anyone in the US in a tax efficient way to help support the work that's being done by these organisations back in Australia. And you can find their website at friendsofbushheritage.org. So we really appreciate any support that anyone can provide through that. Or feel free, if you would like to learn more, to look at the website or contact us through the website or via email to learn more about the projects that we are doing and how we spend that money. We're almost done. We will connect back with Bush Heritage and Wires over the next couple of years and keep you all informed around progress on rehabilitation and recovery and the commitment to supporting conservation work in Australia. And very lastly, I'll give Leanne and Heather, the CEOs, a final word, if you don't mind. Very quickly, how can everyone on the webinar now support the protection of Australia's biodiversity? What can folks do? What's the message for them?
Thanks, Chris. Look, I would love it if our friends in the US and Australia could follow us on social media and have a look at what we're doing. Come on the journey with us. Go to our website. You can sign up for our newsletters, become a virtual carer if you'd like, and you get some behind the scenes information and animal stories and that kind of thing. So that would be great. And just talk to people about it, share the stories, share what's happening in this recovery journey with your friends and family.
Perfect. Heather?
Thanks. And I'd just, reiterate the same message. Share the stories, engage with us, share it with your friends and family. Reach out to us. We'd love to answer any questions that you have. If you want to support us, then as Chris said, there's that opportunity through a tax-effective way in the US, but more broadly. But help us share the message of we only have one planet. It is under stress. But working together, we can achieve amazing things and have a planet that is right for us and is great for our kids and our grandkids and all species to thrive into the future.
Thanks to you both. Lastly, any questions that we didn't get to that were in the Q&A, we will follow up by email, so you will get answers to those. And we are done. I really want to thank again the speakers. I think that was a fantastic webinar, and thank you all for joining from all over the world. It's really inspiring to see and we look forward to staying in touch with you going forward. And we are going to close out with a Bush Heritage video. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye.
Fire has the power to harm the land, but also to heal the land. Our people have been listening and watching how fires move across Australia for more than 60,000 years. We have so much to teach the world about how to manage fire. The recent bushfire crisis has been devastating for all Australians. More than 18 million hectares of our country has been burnt. More than 1 billion animals have been impacted by the recent fires. As the original custodians of this land, that really hurts us deeply. Right Way Fire is burning country at the right time, in the right conditions, to encourage regrowth and regeneration. Lots of Australian ecosystems need fire for new life, but it needs to be the right way fire. In a lot of places, we can't do right way fire anymore because we don't have access to country. The cities are getting bigger and most people don't understand fire. As the world gets hotter and drier and our bushfire seasons become more intense, our traditional knowledge will show us a way forward. If fire is done the right way, country will look after us, our plants, our animals and their habitats.